The Pauline Epistles comprise an important part of the New Testament, yet there are some skeptical scholars who argue that Paul didn't exist and that he didn't write the Pauline Epistles. So how can we be sure that Paul wrote the letters ascribed to him in the New Testament? I'm joined by Christian scholar Dr. Travis Campbell to help us address that question. Okay, Travis, if Paul didn't write his epistles, then who do skeptics claim did write his epistles?
Well, the common answer is that the epistles of Paul were written by students of Paul who were writing in his honor, or at least those from the third generation of Christians who had a high esteem of who Paul was and they were writing in his honor. There seems to be sort of three layers to this. There are the indisputably authentic letters of Paul that scholars just assume outright that he wrote them. They would be Galatians, the Corinthian correspondence, that would be 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and then the book of Romans. That is what F.C. Barr in the 19th century called the Hauptbriefe, the foundational letters, those that we just don't really bother with questioning that Paul wrote them. Now, as of the early to mid-20th century, 3 more letters were added to those generally accepted epistles, and that would be Philippians and 1 Thessalonians, and then Philemon. The rest of the epistles are greatly questioned, but some to differing degrees. For example, Ephesians is questioned by a great number of scholars, and you'll get different statistics depending on the scholar you're reading. Raymond Brown, in his introduction to the New Testament, says that as many as 80% of scholars living today reject the authenticity of Ephesians. In fact, one of the greatest commentaries on Ephesians written in the 20th century is Andrew Lincoln's commentary, and he thinks that Paul did not write Ephesians. However, Harold Hoehner, in his commentary on Ephesians, did an exhaustive study looking at commentaries on Ephesians from the 16th century all the way up to our day, and he concluded in that study that 50% of scholars accept the authenticity of Ephesians, whereas 50% don't. So you have that group of epistles like Ephesians, Colossians, 2nd Thessalonians, where there's a lot of people questioning whether they wrote them. Very good scholars can be found that accept the authenticity of those epistles. Very good scholars can be found who reject the authenticity. And then the pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, are vastly rejected by critical scholarship as having been written by Paul. Conservatives still believe that Paul wrote them, but the vast majority of scholars think that he didn't. So how would I go about defending the idea that any of these epistles are authentic? And I'd start with Galatians. And I would start with some statements we find in some of the other epistles generally thought to be authentic. For example, there's a phrase in 2 Corinthians 10 where Paul mentions the fact that he was known as a letter writer. Well, how would that tradition arise if he didn't at least write some letters that we would have recovered? And since Paul was highly esteemed, it makes sense to think that people would have gone out of their way to preserve his epistles. And when you get to Galatians, you find all kinds of statements there that just have the taste or feel of an authentic epistle. Autobiographical details are given that are just sort of written off the cuff without a whole lot of development. For example, Paul says, I, Paul, write this letter. In fact, he identifies himself as Paul twice in the epistle, in Galatians 1:1 and then in Galatians 5:2. Paul also speaks about his interaction with the apostles in passing and doesn't really try to build a whole lot off that except just the sheer fact that he had done his research, making sure that his gospel was in continuity with theirs. So when you have these kinds of off-the-cuff statements, the internal evidence is very strong that Paul wrote these words. The external evidence is also very strong for the authenticity of Galatians. We have early church fathers like Polycarp attributing verses in Galatians to Paul. And so there's a concerted effort among the earliest writers outside of the Apostolic College, the first tier of writings, if you will, saying Paul wrote this. And so if you're going to come up with an argument for the inauthenticity of Galatians, the burden of proof is clearly on you. Now, why is Galatians so important? The vast majority of scholars agree that Paul wrote this. In fact, Raymond Brown says there's no real serious questioning of the authenticity of this epistle. And once you get that nose under the camel's nose under the tent there, that is a camel's nose that you get under this tent, Galatians becomes sort of a standard that you can compare other epistles to. So one of the reasons why we think he wrote Romans is the content of Galatians and Romans is so similar. And the style between Galatians, Romans, and 1st and 2nd Corinthians is also so similar. So those 4 epistles really do bear the marks of authenticity. And this is one of many reasons why we think Paul wrote those 4. And you can also give other arguments that he wrote the other epistles as well.